time we left something I hadn't thought about it, so I watched this interview. So apparently, when they arrested these 46 people, no drugs were found on them, right? Which is illogical, right? Given that you're accusing someone of being a drug dealer, so you expect, at least when you arrest them and you raid their house, that you're going to find some drugs on their person. But in this case, no drugs were found in the possession of any of these people. Also, I think what the lady was saying, that how do you have 46 drug dealers in a town of 5,000 people is definitely illogical. But I think when you think about the situation in Tulia, I think there's something of a broader cause that's going on, and it's the whole war on drugs and how we fund police departments or give police departments money when they make more arrests. And in a case like Switzerland County or Toledo, which is a very small population, or population overall, probably over time has been declining. And so when you have declining populations, you have less revenue, less money. And so they probably saw this as a way of, getting some revenue, is by making more drug arrests, even if those drug arrests may not have been valid or lawful. Um, and I'm not to say that this is a case that's going on all over America or the police departments are uniformly bad. But when you interpret or people see things like Talia, it's usually the negative events that really have some big impact on how people perceive the police overall. Right. So again, I'm not saying that Tom Coleman's are everywhere or that Tom Coleman signifies what law enforcement is in America today. But it's definitely those negative events that have salient and impactful effects on how we perceive the police. So for this week, moving into policing. And so as I mentioned last time, right, we're moving away from criminal offending and victimization by race and ethnicity, right? We're not focusing on the causes of crime or explaining differences in crime across race and ethnicity. Now we're looking at the experiences of different populations, different groups within the criminal justice system. And so we're going to start with the first stage of the criminal justice system, which is law enforcement or police. And so with police, we typically think of them as the front line of the criminal justice system. What this means is that you can't go through the process of the criminal justice system, right? You can't go through the courts. You can't be in prison without first coming into contact with law enforcement. And many of us will go through life, right? It's not all of us, but many of us will go through life having some form of contact with the police, right? Hopefully it's not an arrest. But most of us probably have or will, go through life being pulled over during a traffic stop, right? Having that interaction with the police, or maybe calling the police when you have a problem, right? Or you witness a crime occurring, or you've been the victim of a crime yourself, right? We're going to have some sort of contact with the police. And that's not true with other agencies, right? Most of us will probably never have any contact with a district attorney or criminal court judge or probation officer. Police are the exceptions, right? And for many of us, they kind of represent the law and enforcers of the law. But another word I want to emphasize for the police is that they're also known as the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system, right? Gatekeepers. Again, getting at this idea that in order to enter or go through the criminal justice system, you first have to come in contact with the police. So when we talk about law enforcement, especially in regards to race and ethnicity, there's a great divide or large divide in public confidence and trust in the police across race and ethnicity. And we'll talk about why that is here in a little bit, but a lot of it has to do with historical origins, historical events of how police have treated minority populations, especially Black populations. So it's well known in criminological research that when we do public opinion poll on different racial and ethnic groups, there's a large divide in terms of how different groups perceive the police. So when it comes to trust in their ability to solve crime, respond quickly to events, protect you and your family from crime in the community, and enforcing the law equally. There's a great divide across race and ethnicity. And typically, what we see is that whites will have the most confidence in the police, most trust in the police. Asians and Hispanics tend to fall somewhere in the middle. And then blacks near the bottom. And we talk about public trust and confidence in the police. But what I want to emphasize is that how we think of policing today versus, say, 50 or 100 years ago is, for the most part, radically different, right? Police have done a decent job or a good job, depending on who you ask, it varies. But police themselves have improved in terms of how they function as a law enforcement agency, right? Some have improved more than others, right? Some departments have improved more than others. But it's well known that today's police force is more diversified, right? We have more females, more minority representation in law enforcement agencies. Right? We have some African American or Hispanic or even Asian individuals who are police chiefs of their local agency. They're also more professionalized. A much larger segment of police officers today versus in the past have a college degree. And even here at Sam Houston, right, we have our Law Enforcement Management Institute of Texas, or LEMA for short, where we encourage or facilitate professional development trainings among executive police officers, mainly police chiefs, other people in executive positions that come to LEMA at least once every 2 years to receive some sort of training, right? So there's a lot more dedication to professionalizing the police force. Also, police agencies, especially some of the large ones like Houston Police Department, Dallas is another great example, that they have their own research units within their law enforcement agencies to help drive police officer decision making or agency decision making. And this graph here just shows how over time there's been an increase overall in the United States of minority officers and female officers as well. Right, so overall, an increase over time. All right. So where do the origins of policing, at least in the United States, come from? In England? Yeah. Sir Robert Peel is one. But did y'all listen to the podcast? I'm sure y'all did, right? The Slave Patrol. Yeah. Slave Patrol. Do y'all agree with that? Or no? No, do you agree with the origins of policing? Does it have, at least in the United States, does it have any origins in slave patrol? What did they say in the podcast? Right? How did law enforcement back in the era of chattel slavery operate as? Or how did the slave patrols operate during that time? Yeah, yeah. So there was, in some cases, back in the early era of chattel slavery, there was essentially like a draft, right? People were chosen and required to serve as slave patrol officers, right? And it was their job to control the movement of slaves, especially the movement between plantations, to put down any uprisings and to carry out any punishments against slaves who were found to have run away. And in the podcast, um, the person's name that they're interviewing, his name is Khalil Gibran Muhammad. He's a historian at Harvard. And he talks about how, even as slavery ends, the role of law enforcement changes as well. So when we get to the era of segregation, right, whereas the slave patrols used to enforce, the slave codes and those types of things. When it came to the era of segregation, it was usually law enforcement that were enforcing segregation laws, right, primarily against black populations. Any other thoughts on the podcast? What are your thoughts on what Muhammad said about law enforcement's role or police officers' role in many of the race-related riots that occurred in the early 1900s? What role did police have, according to Muhammad, in many of the era's race-related riots that predominantly occurred in many of the urban cities? A, a lot of arrests, yeah, definitely. Anything else? Anything at all? So here's my interpretation of what Muhammad said. Muhammad said that when it came to many of these race-related riots, excuse me, sorry, in the early 1900s, and this is not an exhaustive list, right? This is not all of the race-related riots that occurred in the early 1900s. These are just some of the major ones. But according to Muhammad, law enforcement was either directly involved in the violence by carrying out violence against often black communities, or sometimes just sitting idly by while mobs attacked black communities. As we'll talk about also here in the Dutsu riot, Latino community. So let's talk about these eras of race-related riots. And again, as I emphasized, right, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the well-known ones that occurred during this period. So think about the three eras, the three dates I have listed here: 1917 to 1919. During that time period, what's going on in the world? World War One's going on. Correct. Yes. So the first era of race-related riots coincided with the era of World War One. And there's also, as you see here, right, most of these cities, locations that are listed here, like Newark, New York City, Detroit, Chicago, most of these places are in the north, but there's also some in the south. And then there's one case here, the Houston riot, right? Many of you are from Houston. Have you ever heard of the Houston riot of 1917? Yeah? No? Yes? Okay. So let's watch a quick video on that, talking about the Houston riot. Holden Marshall.
See, signed up for the military as a teenager. He's about 15 or so years old. The story that was passed down was that a box came to the home of his mother. His mother did not want him to go into the military. This box that came to the home that had his coat, a letter, and a Bible, and $1. And the letter said that, Mother, when you read this letter, I'll be in glory and I'll be dead. So at the time of whatever it was that he died, the place of his death, his burial, nobody knew. That was a mystery in the family for 17 years. Houston received 2 contracts to build training facilities here, Ellington Field and today we know as Memorial Park, Camp Logan. The 3rd Battalion of the 24th Negro Infantry Regiment was sent here to guard the construction of Camp Logan. But we have to keep in mind is that when they do come to Houston, which is a southern city that doesn't want African Americans there armed with weapons, is that they were subject to Jim Crow laws. They were subject to police harassment. So the night of the Houston riots, what has just vitally important is that these men simply had enough. They'd had enough. They were tired of being treated like second-class citizens, and they took action. Quite frankly, they reached the breaking point. We're standing in the Fort Sam Houston Gift Chapel. Now, behind me, this is where, because there is so many soldiers. Remember, there were 122 who were actually accused. They needed the largest building to carry this out that was on base. And the chapel was not completed at that time. So all the things you see around you now, obviously, were not here. The actual trial took place rather quickly. The Army wanted to get this done because they did not want to create a spectacle. Keep in mind, this was the largest court martial in U.S. Army history. For this trial, the fact that it was carried out what many Americans thought were in secret with the racial tension of the day, you have to remember from a military standpoint that the Army still operated under the Articles of War. Remember, in April of 1917, the United States does go to war with Germany. So when these soldiers carried out their action in Houston, it was seen as a sign of mutiny. We're at Fort St. Houston Golf Course at the 15th tee, and this area served as the execution area of where 13 members of the 24th Infantry Division African American soldiers were executed here behind me. And this is the area where the gallows would have been erected. As a direct result of what happened for the outcome of the trials and the executions, the Army issued General Order Number 7. And what this basically did, it created a type of appeal system where the soldiers from a court case, when the punishment didn't seem fair, it could go as high as the president. So now we have a system in place where we could have more transparency.
So the Houston riot, what makes it a little bit different from all the other riots is that most of the conflict under the Houston riot predominantly involved the 24th Regiment of the U.S. Army, which is a predominantly African American regiment, and the local Houston Police Department. Yes, there were some local Houston citizens that were involved in the conflict, and it actually escalated or started when some of the members of the 24th Regiment were defending these local black citizens who they felt were being harassed by local police. But for the most part, where the conflict was between the 24th Regiment and the local Houston Police Department, as mentioned in the video, right, largest mutiny ever in U.S. history. The Chicago race riot, this one I think is often referred to as probably the worst one that's ever occurred. This is the riot that Muhammad documents in his podcast as well. The next Next set of riots, 1943. What's going on? Context there. World War II, okay? So 1943, have another set of riots. The one we're going to watch a video here on is the Zoot Suit Riot. And what makes this one a little bit distinct from the other ones is that where the other ones predominantly involve conflicts between blacks and whites, and the Zoot Suit Riot, it's mainly Latinos and whites. It takes place in Los Angeles in 1943. So much quick video on the Zoot Suit Riot.
A group of American sailors attacked a group of mostly Mexican Americans in East LA. The city exploded. In hindsight, this seemed inevitable. With many young men overseas as a result of World War II, labor in the United States was in short supply. So in 1942, the US government reached a deal with Mexico named the Bracero Program, which allowed some Mexican citizens to move to the US as temporary workers. Los Angeles already had a large Mexican American population, but this new influx of workers provoked greater racial animosity. Much of the white population, whose views were echoed in the mass media, blamed Mexican American teenagers and young adults for various issues in the city, especially crime. Even the way Mexican Americans dressed angered the city's more conservative population. Many young Mexican Americans started donning the zoot suit, a style that incorporated an oversized coat, pork pie hat, long chain, thick-soled shoes, and baggy pants. This fashion evolved out of Harlem nightclubs and was popularized by cultural icons like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. The suits themselves weren't inherently offensive, but in the context of World War II, they were. You see, during the war, wool had been rationed in order to make uniforms for the troops. The very manufacturing of zoot suits with their excessive use of fabric was banned, but a black market developed, and so those zoot suit wearing Mexican Americans, known as pachucos, were seen as unpatriotic. On the night of August 1st, 1942, pachucos were involved in a brawl in a home near Los Angeles' Sleepy Lagoon. The next morning, the body of Jose Diaz was discovered nearby. The media and police quickly blamed the zoot suit wearing 38th Street gang. Hundreds of pachucos were rounded up, regardless of affiliation. 22 were eventually found guilty for the Sleepy Lagoon murder in what was later considered a great miscarriage of justice. To some, the verdict was grossly unfair. To others, it confirmed what they already believed, that the zoot suit wearers were inherently violent. This all helped to create a powder keg bound to explode. A few months later, a group of 16 American sailors stationed in Los Angeles claimed they were verbally taunted by a group of Pachuco zoot suiters. Seeking retaliation, the servicemen took cabs over to the Mexican neighborhoods in East LA and started attacking those wearing zoot suits with makeshift weapons. The Pachucos were thrown into the street, their zoot suits torn off and burned on the spot. The ensuing riot continued to snowball over the following days. Violence spread to include both Pachucos and young African American men. But instead of arresting the attackers, police arrested the victims, supposedly for their own protection. By June 8th, the rioting had become so severe that all military personnel were banned from Los Angeles, and military police were brought in to subdue the attackers. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the impact of the Zoot Suit riots would reach far beyond the number of casualties. Once the dust had settled, Governor Earl Warren commissioned a report that was meant to paint Californians in a more positive light. Instead, the Independent Citizens Commission found the chief cause of the riots was racism, naming the city's newspapers for encouraging the riots and the city government and U.S. military for allowing those riots to continue. Historians view the Zoot Suit riots as a culmination of anti-Mexican racism that had been building for years in Los Angeles, exacerbated by the stresses of World War II. The riots forced the country to face these problems head-on and confront the systemic oppression faced by Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and throughout the country.
All right, so that's the Zoot Suit riot. So with the Zoot Suit riot, there was no casualties or deaths associated with that one, whereas with many of the other ones discussed here, there were often dozens of deaths involved. I always get a chuckle when I see the Zoot Suit riot videos because I see the men with the long and baggy suits, and then I think about some old pictures of my deals that my mom would always show me, and that's always how they look. Right? It's kind of like Zoot suits. So it's kind of like style in the old days. But also talking about some of these riots, one thing I need to emphasize is that maybe one of the tensions that would cause these riots is the growth of minority population. So in the case of the Zoot Suit riots, you had programs like the Bracero program, which was a legal immigration program that often relied on foreign laborers to come to the United States, especially in the context of World War II, where you have many men overseas fighting. We relied on Mexican labor to work the agricultural lands. If you know the word bracero means brazos, or extends from the word brazos, which means, it means arm or hand, but the program itself is designed in the context to label these people as farm pickers or agricultural workers. But in both of these areas, even the Houston riot or Chicago riot and the Zoot Suit riot, you have growing minority populations that are offering or basically a source of tension for the native populations. And that's something else that Muhammad points to in his podcast when talking about these different riots. So the last set of riots I don't have a video for, but it's the era of 1964, 1968. Now that one, what I would associate with it is the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement, right, in the late 1960s, very turbulent period in the United States, probably the most turbulent period in U.S. society ever. But also during this era, you had increasing crime rates going on in the United States, right? So after a decline in crime, especially after the 1950s, in the 1960s, we start seeing crime, especially violent crime in the United States, go up. You also have the Vietnam War and protests against the war going on during this period. But for the most part, it's an era that's dedicated to the civil rights movement. So during all these three eras and across these different riots that occurred, what I would argue is that law enforcement were either directly or indirectly involved in these riots. You saw examples of those in some of the videos. Now, in the late 1960s, because of rising crime and tensions between blacks and the police during that time period, there was a crime commission that was put together by then President Lyndon Baines Johnson, known as the Carter Commission. Right? It's one of the largest, most notable crime commissions ever assembled. And during this crime commission, a man by the name of Dr. Kenneth Clark had this to say when talking about all the different riots that had occurred in the early 1900s. He says, I read that report of the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it is as if I were reading the report of the investigating committee on the Harlem riot of 1935, the report of the investigating committee on the Harlem riot of 1943, the report of the McComb Commission on the Watts riot. I must again in candor say to you, members of this commission, it is a kind of Alice in Wonderland, with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendations, and the same inaction. Right? So what Clark is saying here is that every time there's a race riot that occurs, in those crime analysis, those crime reports, there's always the same hypothesized causes, the same recommendations, but there's little that's ever done to address racial conflict going on that's the source of these race-related riots. And also, right, in the podcast, Muhammad talks a lot about police bias during this era, right? So there was a lot of police bias, a lot of police violence against African American community. This next section, I just want to briefly talk about some of the issues between different communities, right, different races and ethnicities, and the main issues that they have with local communities. So, in regards to the African American community and their experiences with the police, we know based on prior research that in comparison to all other groups, African Americans have the most contact with law enforcement. And this can be attributed to several factors. One is that we know because African American and Hispanic communities tend to have higher levels of disadvantage, they also have higher crime rates. Right? So it's well known that Black and Latino communities have higher crime rates. And so as a response, we can expect that maybe police officers are dedicating more resources, more personnel to places or communities with higher rates of crime. And those most often tend to be either Black or Hispanic communities. Also, certain police tactics, whether we're talking about stop and frisk, which are popular in places like New York and Northeast, or the war on drugs, right? The Tulia, Texas incident. Tom Coleman says, "Oh, right, it was just where the road led me was to a Black community," which is probably not the case, right? He probably purposely targeted the war on drug efforts in the Black community of Tulia, Texas. So certain police initiatives tend to be more likely to be directed at African American communities. And also, the final one is based on 911 call data. And the evidence we have is that African Americans actually call the police more than other racial and ethnic groups. So there's higher levels of distrust, less confidence in the police among African Americans. What we tend to find is that they actually call the police at higher rates as well. We're talking about the Hispanic or Latino community and their issues with the police. So, not really an issue in Texas or like say big cities like Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, but there is several places across the United States where we've experienced or seen growth in the Latino population, and the local law enforcement there may not have enough officers or any officers at all who speak Spanish, right? So when talking about experiences between Hispanic communities and the police, language barriers is often a notable issue. But again, there's some contextual variation here where places with established or already large numbers of Hispanics like Houston and Dallas tend to not have these language barriers issues. We also know, and we've said this, it was discussed in class, that Hispanics, especially Latino immigrants, tend to report fewer crimes to the police. And not surprisingly, the reason why we experience fewer calls to police among Hispanic communities or places with larger Hispanic population is because of immigration enforcement. Right? There's this fear often among Hispanic communities that if they call the police, even if they're reporting a crime or reporting the crime as a victim or a witness, they're fearful that they'll be deported or that someone in their household or a family member in their household will be deported. But immigration enforcement, especially among local police departments, is a very tricky issue. On the one hand, there's jurisdictional issues. This is an issue that's often being fought against in court cases. So we're talking about immigration enforcement. Enforcement of immigration laws falls under the authority of the federal government. Right? So that's how it works. In terms of immigration violations, they're a federal offense, or can be a federal offense. So it's only federal agencies that have the authority to enforce those laws. But federal agencies like ICE know that they can't enforce immigration laws by themselves, so oftentimes they're relying on local police to help them or assist them with enforcing immigration laws. Now, when it comes to trying to enforce immigration laws or trying to work with federal officials in enforcing immigration violations, there's some police departments that are very hesitant to assist ICE agencies with those efforts. And in some cases, that's logical, right? Police depend on the trust of the local community, so they don't want to break that trust by trying to engage in immigration enforcement, right? They really prioritize trust in the police and calls or citizen calls to the police. So there's this debate between sanctuary cities and anti-sanctuary cities. It's really not clear what is a sanctuary city, what's not. There's really no formal definition. But for the most part, we define a sanctuary city whose police department limits some types of cooperation in immigration enforcement between the local police officers and ICE. And so there's this debate that sanctuary cities have higher rates of crime. And this was a study that was done among various police, that enacted sanctuary city policy, right? So these are a list of cities that all enacted some type of sanctuary city policy over time. And this black line here, kind of in the middle, is supposed to designate what effect possibly that sanctuary city had on crime. And so essentially how to interpret this is that all the cities with a blue dot on the left-hand side experienced a decrease in crime after enacting their sanctuary city law. Whereas on the right-hand side, all these cities experienced an increase in crime after enacting sanctuary city laws. And if you look at the chart, it's kind of split 50-50, right? Some cities experienced an increase in crime after the law was implemented, and other cities experienced a decrease in crime after the law was implemented. But even for these cities, it doesn't matter which side of the line they're in, it's hard to say definitively whether for these cities the sanctuary law increase crime, or for these cities of sanctuary law, decrease crime, right? We can't say it definitively with 100% causality. So most of the evidence shows that when it comes to comparing sanctuary cities and non-sanctuary cities, there's really no difference overall in crime. Oh. One more thing. So just as we measure public opinion of the police among different racial and ethnic groups, we focus on immigrant populations specifically as well. And there's this thing known as a contrast thesis, a concept I talked about in my immigration and crime class. But there's this assumption that because of this fear of the police, fear of deportation, that immigrants are less trusting of the police, just like other minorities, right? There's that assumption. However, some argue that, yeah, you know what, high fear doesn't really translate to distrust or lack of confidence in the police. The argument with the contrast thesis is that, you know what, some immigrants, even though they fear being deported, can actually have high levels of trust in the police. And it's because of the contrast between police in their home countries and police here in the United States. So, for many Latino immigrants, how do you think they perceive police in their home country? Whether they're from El Salvador, whether they're from Colombia, maybe, from Mexico, what's the assumption of police for those immigrants from those places or those countries? That the officers are corrupt, right? Maybe they're aligned with cartels, right? Often the assumption is that if you get pulled over by a local police officer, maybe in Mexico, that you give them a little money and then he'll let you go, right? So there's this idea of widespread corruption, sometimes associations with violence, right? Especially if police departments are embedded within cartels, that they just can't be trusted, right? Police in their home countries. However, when they come to the United States, a lot of Latino immigrants feel like, you know what, that occurred in my home country, but here in the United States, police officers are different. They're not corrupt, right? They're not engaging in widespread violence like I saw in my home country. And so there's this contrast between how they perceive police in their home countries and how they perceive police here. And they often, especially for Latino immigrants, perceive police in the United States to be much better and have higher confidence in the police. Yes, there's still this fear of deportation, fear of contact in police, but overall greater levels of trust for police here in the United States versus in their home countries. So that's the contrast thesis. All right. So going back to the Native American community, we haven't really focused on this since the last class period, or since the first class lecture we had. So we talked about how Native American communities, right? Most communities are their own autonomous region, right? They have their own police force, and they have their own court system as well. However, there's unique and very complex jurisdictional issues that tribal police departments experience or have to contend with. So for the most part, this has changed over time, but historically speaking, tribal police only had authority to arrest people who were Native American citizens. And they only had jurisdictions over their own territory or land. Right? So if you're a tribal police officer, only had jurisdiction, authority to arrest people who were Native American citizens and who committed a crime on the Native American land or reservation. Historically speaking, if I'm a non-Native American citizen and I go into a Native American community, and if I assault someone who's of Native American descent, tribal police has no authority to arrest me, right? Because I'm not a Native American citizen. Now that's changed recently, but historically that's the way it operated. And so for the most part, again, just to highlight, tribal police only have jurisdiction over Native American citizens and for crimes that occur on Native American land. So historically speaking, right, we have given Native American communities the authority to kind of be in charge of their own territory, right, their own lands, over their own people. But historically, the way it's worked is that even though we've granted them lands, we've over time, started chipping away at their power, chipping away at their land. And so, I'd like to illustrate this with a story one time. One time I bought a Stan Houston State shirt, and I got home and I showed my wife and I was like, hey, look, check out this shirt that I got. I don't know if it was given to me by the department or something. So I was showing it to her. I was like, hey, here it is. And for some reason, she thought that I had given her the shirt, right? There was miscommunication somewhere. I don't know where. It wasn't by me. But she misinterpreted. She thought it was a gift for her. I was like, no, it's for me, right? And so one day we're driving, and I have the shirt on. And she's like, hey, you're wearing my shirt. I'm like, no, it's my shirt. I'm like, you don't need to go here, right? And so she calls me an Indian giver. And I was like, so my wife and I have been together, not married, but been together for 18 years. She's called me a lot of names, right? Good and bad, mostly bad. I'm just kidding. But this one, I didn't know what that meant. I was like, what's an Indian giver? What is that? Has anyone ever heard that? Yeah. Some of y'all, what is it?
It's like when you give it to someone and then you take it back.
Then you take it back. Yeah. Just like how we've operated with the Native American territories, right? We give them territory, we give them power, we give them authority. And then, maybe there's some oil left on this part of the reservation. Let me have that part back. And so that's why she was calling me an Indian giver, because she thought I had given her the shirt. Again, miscommunication, not on my part, on her part. But she called me an Indian giver. But at the time, I didn't know what that was. But when she explained what it was, she explained the concept to me. I was like, wow, I know how I can connect it to class, right? So I started talking to her about how I can connect it to class, and she's like, yeah, I don't want to hear that, She's been, again, right, with me for 18 years, and so at this point, she's done talking about criminal justice and criminology and the research I do, right? She's in education, totally different field. So she's like, I've heard all that already. But yeah, so she called me an Indian giver, but that's historically, again, how policies and treatment of Native American communities have operated. We give them land, and then we chip away. And it's not just territorial land, but it's also power as well and authority. And so in 2020, there was this Supreme Court case known as McGirt versus Oklahoma. So just on the case, Jimmy McGirt was a citizen of Choctaw descent in Oklahoma. And Jimmy McGirt was arrested and convicted for child molestation. And he was given, I don't know if it was like a life sentence, a really long time where basically, he was going to die in prison. Right? He was given many years in prison, and he was prosecuted under the state of Oklahoma. And where the incident allegedly occurred was right here in the dot, which is Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? So this area, these areas are recognized as Native American land, which means that only if you're of Native American descent and the crime occurs somewhere here, somewhere in this region, you are to be prosecuted by tribal courts, or if it's a very serious crime, like in this case, by the federal government. And so Jimmy McGirt appealed his decision. And his argument was not to say that he was innocent, but to say that the wrong entity had prosecuted him, right? It was the state of Oklahoma. And McGirt argued that it should have been the federal government instead. And so, in a very close decision 5-4, the Supreme Court agreed with McGirt. And so, in that court case, right, McGirt was had his conviction by the state of Oklahoma vacated. It's not like he was released; he was still in custody. But then he was formally charged by the federal government. He was taken to court. He was sentenced again to life in prison. Right. So his sentence didn't change. But McGirt was not dumb. He knew that the state of Oklahoma doing time in the state of Oklahoma's Department of Corrections was going to constitute much harder time than if he were to go to a federal correctional institute. And so that was his whole motive was to be prosecuted by the federal government so he could spend the rest of his life in a federal court system, a federal prison, instead of shitty Oklahoma State Penitentiary or something like that. So McGirt's case, right, the implication of this case is that historically, again, we have given authority, we've given power to these tribal groups, but we slowly started chipping away. And the Jimmy McGirt versus State of Oklahoma decision was to reaffirm the rights that we had given to tribal groups when we give them these territories and the right to prosecute Native American citizens. And so over time, there's been some other, as recently as 2020, and since then, there's been some other court cases where now tribal police have the authority to detain non-Native Americans that are committing crimes or allegedly committing crimes on Native American reservations, but it's still up to, for example, a county sheriff to arrest that non-Native American citizen. So we're increasingly trying to give them back some of the authority and power that they've lost over time. We're dealing with the Asian community and their experiences with the police. So Asians are the largest, or excuse me, fastest growing, not the largest, but fastest growing minority population in the United States. But Asian Americans and Asian immigrants have the least amount of contact with law enforcement agencies. This is largely attributed to the fact that, based on research, we find that Asian communities have more rates of crime, right, even lower than white communities. And that Asians themselves, at the individual level, tend to have more rates of arrest and incarceration than other groups. Historically, though, there is some historical events that document tumultuous relationships between, in this case, Chinese immigrants and local police, as designated here in the Chinese Massacre of 1871, which occurred in San Francisco, California. However, more recent research, especially looking at immigrant or Asian immigrant population, find that Asian immigrant and Asian American people generally tend to have more favorable views of the police than, say, non-Asians or compared to other minorities. One interesting case that emerged was during COVID, right? There was this, I think the research showed that there was this age divide between Asian communities and how they wanted police to respond to, say, the COVID crisis and the violence or hate crimes that many Asian communities were experiencing. Many younger Asian groups wanted less police, right? Less police involvement in controlling their communities after these hate crime events, whereas older Asian residents, especially those who were more likely to be victimized or who felt greater vulnerability, wanted more police in their communities. Right. So overall, there was, at least during the COVID era, some age divide in terms of how they wanted police to respond to issues of hate crime and hate crime victimization. Okay. All right. The last time we left off talking about the historical origins of policing, we talked about a lot of race-related riots that coincided with three major events. That was World War I, World War II, and the Civil Rights era. And so in the late 1960s, under Lyndon Johnson, or President Lyndon Baines Johnson, he instituted a crime commission that's known as the Kerner Commission, where they were investigating relationships between minority communities and the police, and figuring out ways to address police bias that was very prevalent during that time. And the Supreme Court also got involved and instituted a series of very, very important decisions that we still talk about to this day. And these Supreme Court decisions were implemented as a way to try to curb or check police power. All right, so the first one, just kind of talk about these very briefly. Matt versus Ohio in 1961. This Supreme Court case is associated with the Fourth Amendment. And in this court case specifically, it's the case that highlights and emphasizes the idea, the right, that police need a search warrant before they can collect any evidence and use it against you in court. Right? So Matt versus Ohio, right, emphasizes the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. They guard citizens against illegal searches and seizures. The next one, Escobedo versus Illinois in 1964. Here, we're focusing on the Sixth Amendment, and that's the right to an attorney. Okay? Right to an attorney. So just highlighting that during any police questioning, citizens have a right to an attorney prior to any police questioning. And we'll talk, not next week, but when we talk about courts, we'll discuss very briefly how that right expanded. Because at first, the right to an attorney was only limited to death penalty cases, but then it expanded to felony cases, and then again to all misdemeanor cases. So prior to 1964, it was a very limited right in the sense that it would only apply to death penalty cases. And then the last one that most of us are familiar with is Miranda versus Arizona. Most of us are aware about our Miranda rights, which again tells us and highlights that we don't have to talk to the police if we don't want to, and if we want to have an attorney present, right? We have the right to remain silent if we choose to invoke that right. So Matt versus Ohio, associated with the Fourth Amendment, guarding against illegal searches and seizures. Escobedo versus Illinois, Sixth Amendment, which is highlights one's right to an attorney, and then the final one, Miranda versus Arizona, highlighting the Fifth Amendment. Okay. So, as we highlighted last time, it's well known in the literature back then and even today that there's racial and ethnic differences in public trust and confidence in the police. So there's a lot of research that looks at public attitudes on the police. Right? And what are the most important factors that predict performance and trust in law enforcement? So race and ethnicity are definitely important factors, important variables. But other important factors are your age, gender, even the crime rates in your local community. So just to kind of highlight what these mean, in terms of age, right, when we do public opinion polls, we survey individuals. Typically what we find is that people that are younger tend to have less confidence, less trust in the police, whereas those that are older tend to have a greater favorability towards law enforcement. Right, so just like race and ethnicity matters, so does one's age. Another one, gender. What we tend to find is actually females rate the police more favorably than men. Right, so females rate police more favorably than males, and crime rates matter as well. With higher rates of crime, or someone who lives in a community with higher rates of crime having less favorable perceptions of the police, right? And so these are really strong findings. We see that these variables matter across many different studies. And then the next one is what we call the under-policing and over-policing paradigm. So when you talk to minority groups or people living in high disadvantaged communities, they often make these conflicting complaints about the police. One is the notion of under-policing, right? Many minorities or those living in high disadvantaged communities might feel like they're under-policed, right? What does under-police mean? Yeah, they might not think, at least in their perceptions, is that the police are not doing enough. That's a good one. Other indicators of under-policing is that they might feel like the police take a long time to respond to 911 calls. I was watching the movie Boys in the Hood the other day. Have you seen Boys in the Hood? Yeah. So there's a clip on Boys in the Hood where I think it's early on in the movie, and the dad catches someone trying to break into the house during the middle of the night. And the dad actually shoots at the intruder, but he doesn't hit him. And so he calls the police, and the police takes over an hour to respond to that 911 call. So that would be an example of under-policing. And then also that video when we were talking about, talking about code of the street. One of the individuals says, if there's someone laying dead on the floor or dying from a gunshot wound, it takes the police forever to respond. But you tell them someone's over there in the corner selling weed, then they're, at the corner like that. So that would be some ideas of under-policing, right? Slow response times, maybe feeling like you're not respected by law enforcement. Those are ideas of under-policing. Now, over-policing is a notion that maybe police are too involved in the community. Maybe there's a lot of stop and frisk going on, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Maybe they feel like the police are constantly trying to pull people over or search people for drugs or other illegal contraband. So those living in minority communities, maybe high crime communities, often make these two complaints that police are under policing or over policing. Another one that matters, probably most important, is what we call direct and indirect contact with the police. So I'll talk about what that means in the next slide. So let me skip over the top talking about legal citizenship and procedural justice. And talk first about what direct and indirect contact means. So direct contact, which is listed here, is an individual's experiences with police. Right? So when we're talking about direct contact with the police, we're talking about your own individual experience with the police. And that could be due to a multitude of reasons, right? You could either have called the police because you were a victim or a witness of a crime, or maybe you had a police encounter because you were pulled over during a traffic stop. How your experience with the police, how you interpreted that situation, can have direct effects on how you perceive the police. So if I'm coming to class, I was a little late today, I admit, right? It was a little hard getting out of bed. It was super cold, and then I'm the one that gets my kids to school and drop them off at daycare. It was a little hard to get them up too. It was a struggle this morning. So I was definitely speeding on my way over here, and I usually drive pretty slow. But say theoretically, I get pulled over, and the cop is super respectful to me, super nice. He lets me go for warning, don't do it again. Hey, my direct experience or direct contact with law enforcement in that instance was very, very good. I got off without a ticket. That's a good day, right? And so how that direct experience is probably going to elevate my confidence and trust in law enforcement, right? So our own individual experiences matter in terms of how we rate the police. What probably matters even more is maybe our vicarious perceptions and experiences. So this is talking about indirect contacts. And this could be indirect contacts, meaning contacts that our relatives, our friends and peers have with the police. Okay? So if your best friend says, hey man, I got pulled over and I felt like I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't commit an illegal traffic violation. And I just feel like, I was being harassed by the police and I felt like this police thought I had something illegal on me when I really didn't. Those types of experiences that your friends tell you about can affect how you yourself perceives the police. And this could also apply to what we see in the news, right? If we see a police officer involved shooting in the news, maybe we see a video of it on YouTube or on the news, and we feel like, hey, that shooting wasn't justified. That itself, that vicarious perceptions, even though this person is not someone related to you, that video itself can affect how you perceive the police. And this one at the bottom, vicarious perceptions, is probably more likely to affect you than the direct experience. Right? Many of us probably have never had a direct experience with the police. But we may have relatives and friends or see incidences of police and citizen contacts on the news. So both of these matter. And they matter because they affect how you perceive and portray the police. Now, going back to these two concepts of legal citicism and procedural justice. We talked about briefly legal citicism before. And you don't have to know this definition, but legal citicism, the way we define it, is that when we view the law or the enforcers of the law, such as the police, as illegitimate or ill-equipped. Okay? So there's two factors that affect legal citizenship, right? One being that you just don't feel like the law is applied equally. You might feel like if you're a minority, that you're more likely to be stopped, you're more likely to be harassed, you're more likely to be searched by law enforcement. Right? So that's one component of legal cynicism, is that you just don't feel like the law is equally applied. I feel like because of my race, because of my gender, my age, maybe I feel like the laws is unequally enforced against me. The other aspect of legal cynicism is where you feel that, hey, I've done the right thing before. I had an incident where, I was victimized. I called the police. Police didn't do anything about it. So next time it happens, I'm gonna, do my own type of restorative justice, right? I'm gonna take matters into my own hands. And that's one of the arguments with the code of the street. It's not that there's this mentality about being violent and trying to maintain the respect. It's that in some inner city communities, maybe citizens feel like, hey, I've done the right thing before, and it just doesn't come out, or the result that I wanted doesn't come out, right? So I have to carry matters into my own hands. Procedural justice is the opposite side, right? It's talking about this emphasis that relationships, from the law enforcement standpoint, relationships with citizens matter, right? I think I mentioned this before. I'm doing a research project where we're surveying police departments across the state, trying to see, okay, what are some of the things they learned in the academy, and are those things that they learned being applied into the real world, and vice versa? What is it that you have to do in the academy that you weren't necessarily? What are some things that you're doing in the real world that wasn't necessarily taught in the academy? And one of the biggest things that come out based on focus groups, doing interviews with various police departments, is we find that some citizens are just not prepared to talk. Some police cadets are just not prepared to talk with citizens, right? They don't have that ability to communicate, to hear both sides of the story, to try to come up with a solution, potentially, right? This is not always the case, but come up with a solution that doesn't involve jail or arrest. So that's one of the big things we're getting, is that some cadets just don't have that basic human interaction skills that's so important for policing. And from a procedural justice standpoint, law enforcement agencies do emphasize good relationships with citizens, right? Being able to talk to citizens, let them know, hey, this is why I pulled you over, being respectful, answering their questions. So that's what procedural justice focuses on. It's the fact that human relationships, human interactions, or interactions with citizens can affect how they perceive law enforcement. All right. So, talking about policing, and we can't have a discussion about race and policing without talking about the defund the police movement that occurred in 2020. So, I just want to ask really broadly, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but what does defund the police mean? We heard a lot about it in 2020, 2021. What does it mean? Your thoughts? Yeah.
I don't know if it's 100% correct, but it's not completely like take the money away from the police stations
Mhm.
or police departments, but taking that money and putting it elsewhere, like
Reinvesting, yeah.
reinvesting again.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's one idea, is reinvesting. So it's like taking money that was earmarked for law enforcement agencies and maybe applying it to social services, especially mental health. Okay. Any other thoughts? Because it's no right or wrong. It's just people see this and it's interpreted differently. How about not even about reducing, I mean, not even about reinvesting, but just reducing police enforcement, or excuse me, police spending, right? The money at a local government that we give to the police is going to be reduced. That could be an idea. Any other ones? Yeah.
So when police are called police, they can lead to incidents of like police brutality, especially in like represent minorities. So like a lot of the money that go into policing with like drug offenses, could go into like programs that would help drug users to very specific
Yeah.
because of just can escalate it and make it worse.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think there's a mindset that proponents argue that, you know what, police are asking too much. And some investment is needed in other types of services and resources that could, in theory, better address the root causes of crime, right? So, defund the police can be interpreted as a way to reduce police spending, to reinvest police spending in other social services like mental health. Or some people take this at face value and want to just maybe abolish the police altogether. So, some of my other research focuses on public opinion on criminal justice policy. And I think that the Defund the Police movement was a pretty good opportunity, to look at research and to look at, what do people really think this means, right? How does defund the police, like in terms of their view, like how do they perceive defund the police? And what factors, what variables affect whether or not people want to defund the police or not? So, I don't know if you know this or not, but the defund the police movement, the protest that happened because of it, was actually the largest protest movement that's ever occurred in the United States. So we're talking about the number and millions of people who were out in the streets protesting during the defund the police movement. It was the largest ever in terms of overall numbers, right? Even more people protesting during the defund the police movement than during the civil rights era, right? So it was a big, big movement. However, what I would argue is that, many people didn't know what defund the police really meant. Also, during 2020, crime rates started to tick up. Okay? And so, when we were asking people, okay, what percentage of you wants to defund the police or wants to reduce police spending, and in a Pew Research Center poll, when looking at racial and ethnic groups, what they found was that in terms of wanting to increase police spending, and this was done in 2021, wanting to increase police spending, Blacks and Hispanics actually wanted to spend more on the police during 2021. Right? Higher levels of spending among Blacks and Hispanics than even whites. And one reason for this is maybe because of rising crime rates and the idea that minority communities have more crime. Maybe Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to want more police because of these rising crime rates. However, I think what I take away personally from the defund the police movement is that it was a call, more broadly speaking, for police reform. So when we look at perceptions of police reform or wanting police reform across race and ethnicity and for all U.S. adults, what we find is that for U.S. adults, nearly 90% of people believe that some major or minor changes are needed to make police better. Right? Only 11% said no, that no changes are needed to make policing better. But the overwhelming majority of Americans, 90-10, said that some sort of police reform is needed. All right. So this is the part where I have to hand out the writing assignment. Don't worry. It's not that hard. 2 of you, for some reason, already turned it in before I assigned it. But there's 2 people that have already turned it in. One of the biggest concerns recently, especially over the past decade, has been tracking police officer involved shootings, right? Whether they're justified or unjustified. There's a problem with this, however. The problem is that we lack any reliable and valid data to track the number of police officer shootings that occur every year. So the UCR, for example, does ask this information and collects it, but again, participation in the UCR is totally voluntary. And a lot of police departments are willing to send the UCR crime data, right? Send them data on the number of homicides and robberies that occur in the jurisdiction. But when you ask them, okay, to send, or you ask police agencies to send data on the number of citizens that were shot and killed by the police every year, whether they're justified or unjustified, many police departments don't want to do that. They don't want to send that specific type of information. And so because we don't have reliable and valid data on the number of police officer shootings each year, other agencies or newspaper organizations, the Washington Post and The Guardian are 2 examples I listed here, do their best to try to track the number of police officer involved shootings that happen each year. So because they're news organizations, they're most often going to rely on news stories, whether they be on video or in print, to try to track the number of police officer involved shootings. And as you can see, there's some large discrepancies here in terms of the number of police officer involved shootings. So in 2014, UCR recorded 444 people that were shot and killed by the police in 2014. In 2015, the next year, Washington Post had a figure of 986. Well, The Guardian had a much higher number at 1,134 people. So even though we have other agencies, other organizations tracking police officer involved shootings, we still get some discrepancies in the total number. But a question is, should we track this information? Should we know how many police officers or how many citizens are shot and killed by the police each year? Is that something we should have? Or should we keep it a secret? Any thoughts?
I think we should have it so that we can hold the departments accountable.
Yeah, that'd be one way. Yeah, or one reason. Anything else? So here's my thought. When it comes to this question specifically, I would argue that we have valid and reliable information on causes or other types of deaths, right? Or different types of causes of death. So things like how many people die of cancer each year, how many people die from vehicle accidents each year, how many people die from heart attacks each year, drownings, right? We have all that information, and it's valid and it's reliable. And also, yeah, if there's a department that has a large number of police officer involved shootings in a particular year, maybe it has something to do with the department, but maybe there's other possible explanations too, right? Maybe that police department has large numbers of police officer involved shootings because that city itself has high rates of crime, more dangerous criminals, or maybe it's the judge in those communities that are the problem. Maybe it's the judge that is letting people out on bail that maybe shouldn't be on bail. So maybe there's other factors, other causes that are going on, and this is important to investigate. Yes, it could be the department or department policy that maybe is the issue, but there could be other factors as well, and it's important to investigate that. So that would be my argument. All right. Start trying to track out shooting over time. Again, this is not reliable and valid data, right? There's some issues with this, but based on the information we have, information we know, is that in the 1960s, the ratio of African Americans to whites that were shot and killed by the police was 8-1 in the 1960s. In 2015, it dropped to 3-1. So an improvement, but still a problem nonetheless. So we're talking about police shootings, still a racial disproportion, as is highlighted here. Now, what were some factors, right? So I would argue that even though we can't say it reliably and the data wasn't very good, I still believe there was a drop, or this ratio that dropped is real. So what are some reasons for that? Well, one possible explanation is changes in policies surrounding the use of force. So in 1985, the Supreme Court heard this case of Tennessee versus Gardner and argued that shooting fleeing felons is unconstitutional. So prior to the mid-1980s, the rule in most departments used to be that an officer can draw and discharge his weapon at a runaway suspect, as long as that officer knew that that suspect was a wanted felon. So even though that person's running away, is not posing a threat, doesn't have any weapons on him or on her, the police can still fire at the suspect if the officer knows, again, that that person is a wanted felon. Now, when I think about this, I always think about the story of when Ted Bundy was captured for the final time. And I don't know if you've seen the news stories on it or maybe watched a documentary film on Ted Bundy. So as many of you know, I did my graduate school at Florida State. And during the 1970s, Ted Bundy had actually been in Tallahassee, been on the Florida State campus, and actually killed, I don't know if it was 1 or 2 sorority girls at a sorority house that was just across the street from the university. So one of our deans at Florida State, I think he's still the dean today, he had been there for years, for decades, and he would tell us stories about how people were just so scared and so frightened during the 1970s when Ted Bundy had come through the town. But when Ted Bundy was finally caught for the final time, it happened in Pensacola, Florida, and he was driving a stolen vehicle that was stolen from the Florida State campus. I think it was actually like a Florida State vehicle that was stolen. And he was driving in Pensacola, and I don't know if he ran a stop sign or something. He got pulled over in Pensacola, and this was overnight, like in the early morning hours. And there was only one police officer working at that time. So that cop pulls over Ted Bundy, and of course Ted Bundy gives him a fictitious name. But during the investigation, this police officer cannot determine this person's real name, can't verify their identity, and so the police officer tries to handcuff or detain Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy starts struggling with the officer, and then is able to get away, and he books it towards a tree line. And so the police officer, not knowing who this person is, gets out his weapon and he shoots Ted Bundy in the back of the leg. Now, in that case, I'm glad that police officer did that. I'm glad he captured Ted Bundy for the final time. But that story really highlights how easy it was back then for police officers to just draw their weapon and fire, even at a person they don't know, right? They don't know who it is. And so that used to be the rule, that for fleeing felons, right, if this person was a wanted felon, you can draw your weapon and shoot them. But now we have what's the defensive life rule that most, if not all, law enforcement agencies institute. That means that whenever police officers are allowed to use deadly force, it's only when they perceive or believe that their life is in danger or the life of someone around them is in danger. Okay? Those are like the rules that constitute when police officers can use deadly force today. Is if they believe their lives or the lives of someone around them is in danger. So it's limiting when officers can use deadly force. That has really reduced police officer involved shootings overall and reduced the racial gap in police officer involved shootings. So, because we're short on time, I'm going to skip over the war on drugs. You go to stop and frisk policy. So stop and frisk policies are policies that are predominantly practiced in the Northeast, right? Especially in very dense cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia. If you've ever been to those cities, you know that it's pretty easy to get around without a vehicle, right? Especially if you live in the inner city. A lot of people don't have vehicles, right? They get around with public transportation, whether it be a bus or a subway. So there's a lot of walking that's involved in those cities, right? People walking from place to place, right? Walking to work, maybe walking to the grocery store, walking to the bus stop. So with stop and frisk policies, what that allows police officers to do is that they have the right to make non-intrusive stops of citizens. Now, what justifies or what allows it to make those stops? It's if they believe that this specific person that they're about to stop has committed a crime or is about to. It's also called a Terry stop, if you've ever heard of it. So if the police officer believes this person is about to commit a crime or has already committed a crime, they're allowed to make a non-intrusive stop and actually search the person, do a pat down for the officer's safety. Now, these non-intrusive stops, again, are often happening in the context where police are often walking the streets or walking the beat, and they're stopping people who are walking, right? Or they're on their way somewhere. If it's in a vehicle, operates a little bit different. If you're in a vehicle, you still, and from a police officer's standpoint, you still have to have a legitimate reason to pull someone over, right? So if I pull someone over because they can't maintain a lane, I can pull them over, right? If I'm a police officer, I can pull over anyone I believe is not maintaining their lane. And then if I go up to the person and I smell alcohol from their breath, or maybe they have bloodshot eyes, I can continue to detain them until I complete an investigation, make sure they're not intoxicated. So these non-intrusive stops, what they were meant to do was to try to search people for drugs or weapons, right? So oftentimes when police are doing these stop and frisk policies, they're searching for weapons and drugs. But when you think about the notion, the idea that police officers have this right to stop someone who looks like they just committed a crime or is about to, what that typically translates to is that this person is usually a male, usually black or Hispanic, and is often young, right? That's predominantly who gets stopped by these stop and frisk policies. Now, proponents of the policy say, hey, this is a very effective general deterrent strategy, and that if it doesn't catch offenders, it's going to affect or reduce future crime, right? And let people know, hey, the police are out there, and we're heavily patrolling communities to reduce crime. Now, on the other hand, people argue, hey, stop and frisk, it leads to racial profiling, right? Because who's more likely to be perceived as a criminal? Probably someone who's black or Hispanic. People might perceive it as harassment. If I'm going about my day, I'm going to work, and I still are continuously getting stopped, I might interpret that as harassment. It's also embarrassing, right? No one likes to be stopped by the police. It's very embarrassing, right? Especially if someone you know is walking past. Now, New York City was very, very influential in using stop and frisk policy. And in 2011, New York Police Department estimated that there were 636,000 stops that occurred by the NYPD. However, from those 636,000 stops, only 12% resulted in an arrest or a ticket. So when you look at whether or not this is effective, 12% doesn't sound very effective, right? A 12% hit rate is not very effective. But NYPD is saying, hey, no, we're also deterring future crime by conducting these stop and frisk policies. So this was very, very big in New York. But New York itself has also experienced a significant drop in crime. So this is the total murders that occurred in New York City over time. And if you look in the early 1990s, there used to be upwards to 2,200 murders every year in the early 1990s in New York City. But over time, now New York City has less than 500 murders every year. So New York Police Department is saying, hey, stop and frisk policies work. Look at this drop in crime. Now, it's really hard to definitively say whether or not this was caused by NYPD stop and frisk policies or due to some other factors. But there is definitely some evidence to say, maybe this worked. Maybe. So for the rest of this time, I want to show a quick video. We're not doing that quick talk enough. One of my favorite videos that I show in this course throughout the whole semester. So we'll show it after exam 1.